Hello, welcome back to my channel. So we're going to think about the challenge of natural hazards. So what actually is a natural hazard? This is a hazard that has the event to cause potential harm to the environment, people, or an economy. A natural hazard is an event caused by the environmental processes that will occur within the world without the presence of humans. The term hazard is used because of the potential impact when a natural event occurs and its impact on humans. A disaster occurs when harm actually occurs to the environment, people, or economy. So, some examples of our tectonic hazards. We have earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, tsunamis. Our geomorphological hazards are our floods and landslides. Atmospheric hazards are tropical storms, droughts, tornadoes, cyclones, whatever else you want to call them, hurricanes. They all come under that umbrella of tropical storms. And then our biological hazards are things like pests and diseases. So, what affects hazard risk? A hazard risk is the chance that an area or population will be affected by a natural hazard. There are a variety of factors which affects the level of hazard risk within a particular area. The first of which is population. As world population increases, more people live in areas which are vulnerable to natural hazards. Urbanisation and population density also have a role to play. So as urban areas are generally more densely populated, there are increasing numbers of people who are at risk within urban areas. Frequency and magnitude of some hazards isn't increasing. So our tectonic hazards aren't increasing because they are natural processes. They are not increasing as a result of climate change, but things like our geomorphological hazards, so floods, landslides, and our atmospheric hazards, so tropical storms, droughts, tornadoes, are increasing as a result of climate change. Because the energy of the heat in the atmosphere needs to go somewhere, and it goes into our weather. Levels of development also affect the hazard risk of a country. So generally, the more high income a country is, the more well prepared they are for a hazard event. Whereas our lower income countries and our newly emerging economies struggle more when a hazard event occurs. Prediction methods also help to influence the effect that a hazard has on an area. So the more prepared we are and the more we predict a hazard, generally we can't predict them all, but we can predict some of them, the better people will be. And human activities such as deforestation and urbanisation also increase hazard risk. So let's think about tectonic hazards. Plate tectonic theory says that you need to know about the Earth's structure. So there are 4 layers to the Earth that you need to be aware of, going from the inside outwards. Firstly, we have the inner core. This is about 1,400 kilometres in diameter, so across. It's solid and a dense layer composed of iron and nickel with temperatures of about 5,500 degrees centigrade. The outer core, moving out, is 2,100 kilometres thick, and it is a semi-molten metal layer with temperatures between 5,000 and 5,500 degrees centigrade. The mantle is about 2,900 kilometres thick and is a semi-molten layer which is less dense than the outer core, and then the crust, its thickness varies depending on where you are. It can go from 20 kilometres thick up to 100 kilometres thick, and it is made up of the 2 different types of crust. One being oceanic, which is thinner but heavier and more dense, and then our continental crust, which is thicker, all the way up to 90 kilometres thick, but it's older and lighter in density. The oceanic crust is continually being created and destroyed as a result of plate movement, where it is denser and so subducts under the continental crust, even though it's thinner. This is why continental crust is much older than oceanic crust, as it isn't destroyed. The crust is broken into a number of tectonic plates. These plates move on top of the semi-molten magma below, in the mantle, and plate tectonic theory once stated that the movement of these plates was as a result of convection currents in the mantle. So this movement, as it's hotter in the centre, that heat rises and pulls the semi-molten magma towards the surface, cools as it's at the crust, and then falls back down towards the outer core again. And it's convection currents that are pulling the crust. This is where we have subduction going on and slab pull. The Earth is made up of different plates that all fit together a bit like a jigsaw. You know, there are two types of plates, oceanic and continental. The continents of the Earth have not always been in the place that we know them today. Alfred Wegener had a theory that continents used to be a supercontinent called Pangaea that existed 250 million years ago. He called his theory continental drift, and it existed in 1915. That's when the theory came out. However, people didn't really believe him until he then died, and then in the 1960s, plate tectonic theory was more widely adopted as the way that the plates have moved. In 1929, a man called Arthur Holmes proposed the idea that it was convection currents under the mantle that were moving the plates. So, what about this distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes around the world? So, earthquakes occur at all plate boundaries, but about 90% of the earthquakes on our planet occur around the Pacific Ring of Fire. Most volcanoes occur at constructive and deconstructive plate boundaries, so they do not occur at conservative boundaries. The majority of active volcanoes, about 75% of them, are located on the edge of the Pacific Ring of Fire. However, there are things called volcanic hotspots, which occur away from the edges of plate boundaries and are plumes of magma which break through the Earth's crust because it's thinner. So a really good example of that would be either Hawaii or the Canary Islands. They are volcanic hotspots. So let's think about the physical processes at plate margins. Plates can move away from each other, they can move towards each other, or they can slide past one another, depending on the speed and direction of the types of plates. So at a constructive margin, this is when the plates are moving apart. New land is formed in the middle or constructed, which is why it's a constructive margin. Iceland and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is an example of this, where the plates are moving apart. We sometimes also call these divergent margins. The large-scale landforms we find here are shield volcanoes. Earthquakes can also form here, but they're not very strong generally because there's no build-up of pressure. And then our small-scale landforms that we found here are things like geysers, or geysers, however you'd like to say it, and lava tubes. So a geyser is a rare kind of hot spring that is like under pressure and then erupts. You've probably seen a picture or a video of it, or you might have seen one yourself if you've ever been to Iceland, and it sends jets of water streams into the air. Geysers are made from a tube-like hole in the Earth's surface that runs deep into the crust. That water is then boiled because of the heat and sent up towards the surface. Lava tubes are a natural tunnel with solidified lava that was formerly occupied by molten lava but is now formed in the shape and basically formed rock. Okay, next we have our destructive plate margins. This is where land is being destructed. Plates are moving together, land is being broken down, or oceanic plate is being broken down. This is where we find a lot of stronger volcanoes, so our composite volcanoes, or our cone volcanoes, or our stratovolcanoes, whatever you'd like to call them. We also have a lot stronger earthquakes here. We have a deep oceanic crust. That's what happens at our destructive margins. We sometimes also call these convergent margins because they're moving together, but destructive is perfectly acceptable. So, as our oceanic crust meets our continental crust, one subducts beneath the other. We also have something called a collision margin. So this is where two continental crusts are still moving together, but as I've already told you, no continental crust is ever destroyed. So instead of one subducting beneath the other, because they're of the same density, they both get pushed upwards. And this is a collision plate margin, and they form something called fold mountains. No magma is present here, but they do form high mountains, such as the Himalayas and Mount Everest. And then our final kind of plate margin that you need to be aware of is a conservative plate margin. This is where the plates slide past each other, either in opposite directions or in the same direction, just at different speeds. So no land is created or destroyed, no volcanoes are present here. However, we do have very strong earthquakes because of a build-up of pressure that is then released. We call this a transform boundary, and a really good example of this is in California on the San Andreas Fault, where the North American plate meets the Pacific plate and causes strong earthquakes. So what about some of these effects of earthquakes? They have both primary and secondary effects. The primary effects are caused directly by the earthquake, such as damage to buildings, cracks in roads, and they are usually limited to the areas closest to where the earthquake happens. But our secondary effects can go much wider. So these are caused indirectly by the earthquake. So, such as fires caused by broken glass or avalanches or landslides. These usually last longer than the original earthquake. And they happen as a result of the earthquake rather than the effects of the earthquake itself. So how do we respond to earthquakes? We measure earthquakes generally now by the Mercalli scale. This is a measure that was thought up by the Italian volcanologist Giuseppe Mercalli in 1906. And it measures earthquake intensity, how strongly the earth shakes and what damage it does. And it's rated on a scale of 1 to 12. However, it's often inaccurate and we don't use it very often now because it depends on personal judgment and it depends where you are and if you're describing that accurately. Whereas we do now use the Richter scale. This is a measure of earthquake's magnitude, how much energy is released in an earthquake. It doesn't rely on people's opinions, but on measurements of energy. And it's measured on a scale of 1 to 10. However, the biggest earthquake we have seen on Earth is a 9. We don't know if the Earth can actually create an earthquake that is above a 9. We don't know if it has that tectonic power. We need a seismograph to measure how much of an impact an earthquake has and its magnitude. So if an earthquake is detected, the seismograph allows for how far away the earthquake can be felt and how deep the earthquake was and how powerful it is. So we're going to compare two different earthquakes and look at some of these effects. One you've probably come across, even if you're not doing it as your case study, was the Japanese earthquake in 2011. It was a 9.0 on the Richter scale and it occurred 129 kilometres off the east coast of Japan. It was 32 kilometres deep, so a fairly shallow earthquake at a destructive margin, but Japan is a high income country. So 1,600 people died. The earthquake lasted 5 minutes and it did cause a tsunami that had a big natural disaster associated with it. We call it the Fukushima disaster, in which the tsunami flooded a nuclear power site and therefore resulted in lots of nuclear waste being exposed, and a lot of people died as a result of that. In comparison, Nepal is a low-income country, and there was an earthquake in 2015 on the Richter scale of 7.9. It was a very shallow earthquake at 8 kilometres deep, and it occurred 60 kilometres away from the capital in Kathmandu. It's on a collision plate margin, so not a destructive one, but a collision, so two continental plates coming together. Nepal is where we find the Himalayan mountains. The quake lasted for 6 minutes, 8,000 people died, and 19,000 people were injured, and there was massive structural damage within the capital city of Kathmandu. But any responses to an earthquake can be divided into two groups. Immediate, which is the days that follow the earthquake, and longer term in the months afterwards. So our immediate responses, rescue teams went in search for survivors, medical assistance could be provided for those people injured, shelter for the homeless, food and water provided, and a lot of these come from international organisations, or what we call NGOs, non-governmental organisations, that come in and help with the recovery effort. But there are also more long-term responses, so things like building homes, rebuilding buildings, improving building regulations, improving evacuation plans, education, repairing water supplies, money from international governments to help rebuild the economy, building transport routes again. These are all different ways that long-term responses can help a country to recover. So, how do we reduce the risk from tectonic hazards? There are 3 P's that you need to be aware of. Firstly, prediction. There may be many pre-shocks to an earthquake, which can be measured on a seismograph, but there might also be a period of relative stability where there's this build-up of pressure. We saw this in Japan, and so there was this build-up of pressure, and then there was this massive earthquake and lots of aftershocks afterwards. Animals will also act strangely, such as dogs will howl before an earthquake. They can generally predict what's going to happen. It's really hard to use animals because it's, again, biased. We can't always predict it using animals, but they can be a good indicator. We can then also think about preparation. So we can prepare disaster plans, organise and prepare hospitals and evacuation centres. We could organise emergency supplies and how to get into particular areas. And then we can also protect. So Japan does this really well. They have introduced protection measures and they have introduced earthquake-proof buildings to be able to withstand the effects that earthquakes have. They know they are in a very tectonically active zone and therefore are at risk of a lot of earthquakes. And so being able to prepare for that because they have the money to do so was a reason that there weren't as many deaths in Japan following a stronger earthquake than that in Nepal. We can have robust shock absorbers on the foundations of buildings to absorb the tremors. Steel frames can sway in the earth's movement rather than concrete, which can shatter. There can be lots of open outdoor areas where people can go safely in an evacuation. These are all ways of protecting against tectonic hazards. So I do hope this has been useful. Please do... Oh, if this is your first video with me, hi. There is a link down in the comments for you that you may or may not find useful. It's essentially a revision page. You'll be able to purchase revision guides there. There are already loads of free resources there, like past questions, there's recall questions. There's a way that if you would like to book a tutoring session with me, they are all down there if you would like. I think that's all you need to know for now. If your spec is not down below in the comments, there is an email down there. Please do drop me a message and I am more than happy to get you the link for your specific revision homepage. But yeah, I do hope this has been useful. Please do share it with who you think might find it helpful, and I will see you in the future. Bye!